The history of military technology isn't just about successful solutions. It's also about projects that looked logical on paper, but proved to be dead ends in reality. In this video, we'll examine several strange examples of armored vehicles and analyze what problems they were supposed to solve and why they failed. Object 279, one of the most unusual tanks ever created in the Soviet Union. It wasn't designed for classic tank battles or even for breaking through defenses. This machine was created with the expectation of war that would begin after a nuclear explosion. In the late 1950s, military engineers seriously discussed a scenario in which atomic weapons would not be the finale of a conflict, but merely its beginning. It was believed that after the first strike, the battlefield would change beyond recognition, destroyed terrain, craters, debris, powerful shock waves. Conventional tanks seemed vulnerable in such conditions. Object 279 was conceived as an answer to this threat, a tank that should maintain mobility and stability where other armored vehicles could be overturned or simply get stuck. The main feature of the machine was its running gear. Instead of 2 tracks, it had 4. This configuration provided a wide support surface and reduced ground pressure. It was assumed the tank could move across loose soil, snow and debris formed after an explosion. Equally important was the hull shape. It had a streamlined, almost ellipsoidal form without pronounced vertical sides. It was believed that the shockwave wouldn't be able to catch such a hull and overturn the machine. The low silhouette and wide base was supposed to keep the tank on the ground even under strong external impact. On paper, this logic looked convincing. In calculations, Object 279 really did possess high stability and cross-country capability. Tests showed that the machine moved confidently across difficult terrain and demonstrated unusual mobility for its time. But along with this, the downside of the idea began to emerge. The 4-track scheme proved extremely complex in production and maintenance. The number of rollers, wheels, and suspension elements sharply increased. Each breakdown required more time, more spare parts, and more qualified repair work. In real army conditions, this became a serious problem. Technology must not only meet calculations, but also be repairable. It must be serviceable in field conditions quickly, sometimes at night, without ideal tools and spare parts stock. Object 279 was too complex and too expensive for mass application. Even with all its advantages, it didn't fit into practical military logic. Moreover, views on future warfare were gradually changing, and the bet on super-complex machines began to seem doubtful. As a result, the project was closed. Only one full-scale specimen was built, which has survived to our day as a museum exhibit. Object 279 became a symbol of its time, a monument to an era when engineers seriously tried to design technology for the world after an atomic strike. They believed in it, not because it was ideal, but because it gave hope that even in the face of nuclear war, control could be maintained. Have you ever seen an armored barn on tracks? Meet the A7V, a German tank from World War I. The First World War, trenches, mud, artillery, and thousands of meters of barbed wire. This is where a new idea appears. A tank. A machine that should pass where infantry dies in minutes. Germany long observed British tanks, then decided to make its own response. Thus appeared the A7V. No one really knew what a tank should be. No schools, no experience, no successful examples. There was only the front, where everything got stuck in mud, and the feeling that something indestructible needed to be urgently invented. The German approach was simple. If war turned into storming fortresses, then the tank should also be a fortress. The A7V is a huge angular box with vertical walls. Inside, up to 18 crew members, commander, mechanics, gunners, machine gunners. Armament, a gun in the frontal part and several machine guns along the sides. The idea was obvious. The tank moves forward and fires in all directions, suppressing everything around. It was believed that a large amount of weaponry and people would compensate for the design's shortcomings. If the tank is slow, it will still suppress the enemy with fire. If uncomfortable, at least well protected. If cumbersome, at least psychologically oppressive. On paper, this logic looked acceptable. In trench warfare conditions, the tank was indeed considered as a means of direct pressure, not maneuver. However, the real battlefield quickly showed the weaknesses of this approach. A high hull meant a high center of gravity. Short tracks poorly handled craters and uneven terrain, mud, soft ground, and destroyed areas, for which the tank was created, became serious obstacles for the A7V. Cross-country capability proved limited, and when stopped, the tank turned into a large, highly visible target for artillery and anti-tank weapons. No less problematic was internal organization. A large crew and a cramped hull meant noise, overheating, and control difficulties. Coordinating the actions of 18 people inside a combat machine was far from ideal. As a result, the A7V never became a mass weapon. Only a few dozen machines were built, and their combat use was limited. The tank didn't change the course of the war and didn't become the basis for further design development. The A7V remained an intermediate stage. They believed in it because the very idea of a tank was new and unclear. Maus, 1944. Not enough fuel, hostile skies, factories under attack. And at this moment, Germany decides, let's build a 188-ton monster and call it Maus. This decision looks strange, even by late war standards. Industry is working at its limit. Logistics are collapsing. Combat experience clearly shows the value of mobility. But precisely then appears a project for a super-heavy tank that should become not just a weapon, but a symbol of absolute invulnerability. Maus was conceived not as an ordinary tank. It wasn't planned for maneuverable breakthroughs or deep raids. This was the idea of a mobile fortress, a machine impossible to destroy with frontal fire. The project's logic was extremely straightforward. If the enemy destroys tanks, then armor isn't thick enough. If a tank is vulnerable, then it needs to be made so protected that it simply stops being a target. Thus was born the concept of a machine that theoretically could not be penetrated by either existing or prospective anti-tank weapons. Maus received colossal armor. The hull and turret front reached values inaccessible to most guns of the time. Armament matched the scale. A heavy, large-caliber gun designed to destroy any armored vehicle at distance. But behind this logic immediately began problems impossible to ignore. The machine's mass went far beyond anything tank forces had ever worked with. Not a single standard bridge could withstand such weight. Railway transportation required special platforms. Even moving along roads became a non-trivial task. To solve the transmission problem, engineers applied an unusual scheme. The engine worked as a generator, and movement was transmitted to the tracks through electric motors. In fact, Maus was closer to a locomotive than a classic tank. Methods for crossing water obstacles were separately worked out. Since bridges were inaccessible, it was assumed the tank would walk along the river bottom, receiving air through a hose from a machine on shore. On paper, this looked feasible. In practice, any mistake meant losing a unique and extremely expensive machine. The further the project advanced, the more obvious the contradiction became. Maus really was almost invulnerable in frontal projection, but it was slow, complex in maintenance, and extremely dependent on terrain conditions. Any breakdown turned it into an immobile object whose evacuation was practically impossible. Moreover, the situation on the fronts was rapidly deteriorating. War required not individual giants, but large quantities of reliable technology that could be quickly produced and repaired. Maus didn't fit this logic in cost, complexity, or production time. As a result, the project never went beyond experimental samples. Only a few hulls were built, and it never reached full combat use. If one gun is good, then several guns are even better. Thus appears the T-35, the largest and most complex production tank of its time. The T-35 was designed as a breakthrough machine. It should go ahead of infantry, suppressing everything around with fire. Not selectively, but immediately, in all directions. The design reflected this task literally. One central turret with a large caliber gun. Around it, additional turrets with guns and machine guns. In total, up to 5 turrets and a crew of more than 10 people. At parades, the T-35 made a strong impression. Huge silhouette, multi-barrel layout. It looked like a land battleship, a symbol of power and technical superiority. It was believed that such a tank could simultaneously fight infantry, artillery, and light armored vehicles, that the quantity of weapons would compensate for any tactical difficulties that the enemy simply couldn't approach. But behind the impressive appearance were hidden serious problems. First of all, control complexity. Each turret required its own crew. Coordinating actions inside the machine was extremely difficult, especially in combat conditions. The second problem, mobility. Large mass and dimensions limited speed and cross-country capability. The T-35 felt poor on rough terrain, was vulnerable to breakdowns, and required constant maintenance. No less important was armor protection. Despite its size, the tank's armor didn't match its silhouette. The high hull and multiple turrets made the machine a noticeable target, and protection didn't allow confidently withstanding anti-tank weapons fire. Real war very quickly set priorities. In conditions of maneuverable battles and quick strikes, the T-35 proved too cumbersome and too complex. It required ideal conditions that almost didn't exist at the front. By the beginning of hostilities, a significant part of these tanks was lost not in battles, but due to technical malfunctions. Evacuation of such machines was extremely difficult, and repair was labor-intensive and long. Ultimately, the concept of multi-turret tanks showed its failure. Military thinking shifted towards simpler, more reliable and universal machines. Ekranoplan. This is not an airplane, not a ship, and not a rocket. This machine flew at fighter speed but at a height of just a few meters above water. In the Soviet Union, they believed this was the future of naval warfare. The principle of its operation is based on the ground effect. When a wing moves in close proximity to the water surface, a zone of increased pressure forms beneath it. An air cushion reduces resistance and allows the apparatus to stay in flight with less energy expenditure. Formally, the ekranoplan flies, but actually glides over the sea, using properties of the surface itself. In the 1960s, this idea seemed extremely promising to the military. The Cold War was in an active phase, and the main threat at sea was carrier groups. Aircraft were vulnerable to air defense, ships too slow. The ekranoplan looked like a compromise combining aviation speed and fleet cargo capacity. It flew below radar detection. It could carry heavy armament. It was faster than any ship and didn't require airfields. In theory, such an apparatus could suddenly appear at an enemy coast, strike and leave, remaining practically unnoticed. Work on ekranoplans wasn't conducted at the fantasy level. Real machines were built. The most famous became an experimental apparatus that received the nickname Caspian Sea Monster in the West. It was discovered by satellites, but for a long time couldn't be classified. It was too large for an airplane and too fast for a ship. Later appeared a combat version, the Lun ekranoplan. This was no longer an experimental platform, but a full-fledged military machine. Its speed reached about 500 kilometers per hour. Flight range was about 2,000 kilometers. Armament included anti-ship missiles placed in launchers on the hull. Essentially, this was a missile ship capable of flying over the sea. However, during operation, limitations began to appear that were talked about significantly less at the beginning. The ekranoplan was highly dependent on weather conditions. In high waves, takeoff and landing became extremely difficult or impossible. Maneuverability was limited, and maintenance required specialized infrastructure. It couldn't replace an airplane because it didn't gain altitude. It couldn't completely replace a ship because it was too sensitive to environmental conditions. As a result, the ekranoplan proved to be narrow application technology, poorly fitting into existing military doctrine. By the end of the 1980s, priorities changed, funding was reduced, and the bet was made on more universal and predictable solutions. Ekranoplan projects were closed, leaving behind several unique machines and a large number of unrealized ideas. Friends, if you enjoyed this analysis and the topic of strange military technology itself, support the video with a like. It really helps the channel develop. Write in the comments what other projects or specimens you'd be interested in analyzing in this format. Thanks for watching to the end.